September 3rd, 1941. London, England. The hum of the office was relentless. Amidst the countless papers, maps, and murmured conversations of military officers, Margaret Steele sat at her desk in the far corner of room 12. The room smelled of ink, sweat, and too much pipe smoke, and the floor beneath her feet creaked with every footstep. The rhythmic tapping of her typewriter was the only sound that broke the silence. She wasn't a spy, nor a soldier. She wasn't even a strategist. She was just a translator. Her assignment was simple: to sift through intercepted German communications and translate them into English. Hundreds of them came through each day, reams of coded messages, some innocuous, others teeming with military jargon. But this task, in the grand scheme of wartime efforts, was often overlooked. The world of espionage, covert operations, and frontline victories seemed light years away from her desk, buried deep in the shadows of Whitehall. She was part of the invisible machinery that kept the war effort running smoothly, but her work, her role, seemed small. Margaret wasn't naive. She knew how history often forgot the small, quiet players. The generals and the spies got the glory, the medals, and the stories. The translators? They remained faceless, the unsung heroes of the intelligence world. But that morning, the 3rd of September, 1941, would be different. She was just about to file another batch of translated messages when she noticed something strange in one of the intercepted transmissions. It was a German communiqué that, at first glance, seemed entirely routine. A report on troop movements, the logistics of a supply route. But Margaret's mind, honed by months of immersion in the precision and cadence of military codes, detected an irregularity. There was something buried beneath the surface, a hidden order, a shift in tone, a phrase that, when read in conjunction with the rest of the message, didn't sit right. The content wasn't just about supplies or soldiers. It spoke of an impending event, one that would require secrecy, one that was too close to her own country's borders. She read the phrase again. It was coded, sure, but her mind began to trace the meaning between the lines. Invasion was implied, though never explicitly stated. The numbers mentioned were too specific, too precise. They spoke of logistics in a way that made her spine prickle. The timing was wrong. The language was all wrong. Her fingers hovered over the typewriter keys, unsure of what to do. The message she had just decoded was one that could change everything. If her interpretation was correct, and this was indeed a signal of an impending military operation on British soil, it would mark a critical turning point in the war. This was no routine communication. This was a blueprint for catastrophe. For a brief moment, Margaret considered the consequences. If she reported it, the message would go through the usual channels, buried under the weight of bureaucracy and protocol. It might never reach the people who could act on it in time. If she did nothing, however, the consequences could be unimaginable. The whole country might pay the price for a single missed signal, a single overlooked code. Her gut told her that this wasn't just a detail. This was the missing piece of a puzzle that had to be solved before it was too late. But Margaret was not an officer. She wasn't a decision-maker, nor did she have the authority to bring this up to anyone of importance. Her job, as it had always been, was to translate, not to interpret, not to act. But what if her interpretation was the key to preventing a tragedy? Could she sit back and let this slip through the cracks like so many others before it? She hesitated, her thoughts tangled in a knot of duty and fear. Finally, she stood up, her legs stiff from hours of sitting in one position. Her hands shook as she folded the message, the decoded German words staring up at her. Margaret's heart raced as she made her way to the door. The corridors outside her office were crowded with military officers, all of them rushing between meetings, all of them too preoccupied with a larger war to notice the quiet woman who had just stumbled upon something that could change the tide. She knew the drill. She could hand this over to a superior officer. It would be passed along, filed, and eventually forgotten. Or it could be seen as a misinterpretation, an error that might discredit her. But what if it wasn't a mistake? What if this was the key to something far larger? Margaret found herself at the door to Colonel Ramsey's office. He was known for his quick temper and his inability to see beyond the parameters of his own established orders. He had no interest in anything outside of his direct orders. Her eyes flicked down to the folded paper in her hand. Could she trust him with this? She opened the door anyway. The room was dimly lit, with the shadow of a lamp casting long, crooked lines across the papers strewn across the desk. Colonel Ramsey, hunched over a stack of documents, barely looked up as she entered. "Yes, Miss Steele," he asked, his voice clipped. Margaret's heart pounded. "I think I found something." "Important, sir." "A German message. I believe it refers to an invasion. Possibly a planned attack." Ramsey didn't look up. His hand waved dismissively. "We get hundreds of these a day, Miss Steele. We can't follow up on every lead." "I think this one's different," Margaret pressed. "The numbers, the language. It's unlike anything we've seen before. If I'm right, Miss Steele, we're in the middle of a war. We don't have time to second-guess every message we get. Please, leave it on my desk, and I'll have someone look at it." The door slammed behind her as Margaret stepped back into the hallway, a cold chill creeping up her spine. No one would look at it. No one would see the urgency. She knew this was bigger than just one message. But what could she do? She was just a translator. September 8th, 1941. London, England. The weight of the past 5 days pressed heavily on Margaret's chest. Every moment she spent thinking about the message, the invasion, the potential disaster, was a moment spent fighting the quiet battle in her mind. The hours she spent staring at the walls of room 12 felt like years, and yet the silence of her own thoughts was deafening. She had made the choice, and now there was no going back. The hallway outside her office was filled with the usual hustle of military officers, their feet stamping on the cold, gray floors as they rushed from one meeting to the next. They were all busy, too busy to notice the quiet woman sitting at her desk, whose discovery might change the course of the war. She tried to hand the report to Colonel Ramsey, but his dismissive gesture had sent her back into the shadows. They didn't see it, not yet. Margaret's fingers trembled as she placed the decoded message back in the drawer. The words swam in her mind, taunting her, daring her to make a choice. She had always done what was expected of her. She had always followed orders, filed reports, translated documents. That was her role, small, discreet, unremarkable. But this wasn't just any message. This was the key. She knew it, but no one else would believe her unless she proved it. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. The bureaucratic machine of war wasn't designed for action in the face of uncertainty. It was designed for routine, for order. The moment she stepped outside that order, she would be on her own. Margaret stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. She grabbed the message, the paper now wrinkled from the tension of her mind, and without another second of hesitation, she left room 12. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, a sound that felt much too loud for the occasion. She couldn't keep this to herself. The stakes were too high. As she approached the outer office of Admiral Charles Donovan, the head of British Naval Intelligence, her pulse quickened. She'd heard the name many times. Admiral Donovan was the sort of man who made decisions that rippled through history. But he was also the sort of man who believed in the system, who believed in procedure. His world was one of clean lines, clear decisions, and certainty. Margaret felt out of place, even standing outside his office. She wasn't one of the high-ranking officers, the ones who got to sit in the room when the real decisions were made. She was a translator, a cog in the machine. But right now, she had to believe that the machine could fail. The secretary at the front desk eyed her with suspicion, but didn't stop her as she walked past. Determination etched into her face. Margaret had learned long ago to keep her composure, no matter how dire the situation. She reached Admiral Donovan's door and knocked once, sharply. "Come in," a voice called from within. Inside, the room was everything Margaret expected. Stacks of maps, papers, and files lined the walls, and the large desk was cluttered with orders and reports. The dim light cast long shadows over the room, and in the center sat Admiral Donovan, his stern face illuminated by the flicker of a lamp. His eyes were fixed on a map of the European coast, but he looked up as Margaret entered, his expression unreadable. "Miss Steele," he said, his tone giving nothing away. Admiral Donovan, Margaret replied, her voice steady but strained. I have something urgent to report. It's about the German transmissions. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. You've already sent those through the proper channels, haven't you? Margaret's throat tightened. Yes, sir. But there's something more, something crucial. I've decoded a message that indicates an imminent attack. A German invasion, most likely. It's specific, detailed. I believe we have only a few days to prepare. For a moment, Admiral Donovan didn't respond. He simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he took the folded paper from her hands and began reading. Margaret held her breath as she waited. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Donovan's gaze flickered over the words, his face impassive. Finally, he looked up at her. You're certain of this? He asked, his voice low. Margaret nodded. Yes, sir. I've double-checked everything. The numbers, the language, everything fits. It's a direct reference to an invasion force. The silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of her revelation. Admiral Donovan didn't seem to be processing it in the way she had hoped. He wasn't reacting with the urgency she felt. Instead, he put the paper down slowly, as if weighing it in his hands. This could be important, of course, he said, his tone calm. But it might also be nothing more than a misinterpretation. German code is often convoluted, Miss Steele. It's easy to read too much into it. Margaret's heart pounded. But what if it's not? What if it's the signal we've been waiting for? We've seen their build-up on the continent. This could be the beginning of an invasion. The Admiral leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. And you believe this is your responsibility to act on, Miss Steele? You're not an intelligence officer. Your job is to translate, not to make judgments. I understand that, sir, Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. But sometimes the system isn't enough. If I'm wrong, I'll accept the consequences. But if I'm right, we'll be ready, and that will matter. Donovan's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp. Do you know what you're asking, Miss Steele? This is a dangerous game you're playing. If you're wrong, it will cost us time, resources, and perhaps lives. Margaret's stomach twisted, but she refused to back down. If I'm right, then every hour we waste could cost us the war. Please, sir, you have to trust me. The Admiral sighed deeply, rubbing his temples. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his expression softening just slightly. I'll pass this along to the higher-ups, but I can't promise anything. You're stepping into territory that's far beyond your pay grade, Miss Steele. But I'll make sure this gets looked into. You've done your part. Margaret felt a wave of relief flood over her. It wasn't the full acknowledgement she had hoped for, but it was something. She had taken the risk, and now someone, at least one person, was taking her seriously. For the first time in days, she felt a flicker of hope. November 12th, 1945. London, England. The war had ended, but it felt like the world had moved on without her. Margaret Steele sat at a small, dimly lit desk in the far corner of her office. The hum of the city beyond the walls a constant reminder that life, outside this room, was continuing. Outside, the streets were alive with celebrations and victory parades, but inside, a quiet unease gnawed at her. The ink on her final report still felt fresh, even though it had been months since the last transmission had come through. She'd done what she could, but the victory had come at a price that no one seemed willing to acknowledge. The papers stacked in front of her were a cold reminder of the silence that had followed her actions. The invasion she had uncovered had, in fact, taken place. The German forces had attempted their push, but thanks to her persistence, the warning she sent had reached the right ears in time. British forces had been able to move swiftly, preventing a catastrophe. Lives had been saved. The course of the war had shifted, if only by a few inches, but it had been enough to change everything. Yet, none of it had mattered. The reports she had filed after her breakthrough, the long hours spent communicating with military officers who had finally recognized the gravity of her discovery, seemed to have vanished into thin air. Her name had been buried in layers of bureaucracy. The higher-ups, those whose names were always spoken with reverence, had claimed the credit. The orders, the preparations, the success, it was all attributed to them. Margaret's contribution, her risk, her defiance of protocol, had been lost in the shuffle of victory. She stood and moved to the window, staring out at the busy streets of London below. The city had survived the war. The buildings were still standing, and the people were going about their lives as though nothing had ever happened. They would never know what had almost been lost. They would never know the truth of how close the country had come to disaster, and how one woman had seen it first. As Margaret stared at the passing faces, a wave of anger and sorrow washed over her. She had been erased. All her actions, the sleepless nights, the moments of sheer terror as she had defied the system, had been swept aside as though they meant nothing. It was as if she had never existed in the first place. Her office door creaked open, and she turned to see a familiar face. It was Lieutenant Harris, a young officer she had worked with closely during the final stages of the war. He looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and confusion, as if unsure how to broach the subject that hung between them. "Miss Steele," he began, his voice hesitant, "I just wanted to check in. We've received some updates from the ministry. The reports on the German invasion. Well, they've been classified, of course. But I wanted you to know that your name is not in the official record." Margaret didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of his words pressing on her chest. She knew it. She had known it from the moment the war had ended, when the accolades and the reports had been buried under layers of red tape. No one had bothered to acknowledge the one person who had caught the warning sign, who had seen what was coming before anyone else. Harris seemed uncomfortable with the silence that had stretched between them. "You know, Miss Steele, they say that history is written by the victors. But I don't think that's all of it. You did something important. We all saw it. The others may not know it, but we do." Margaret looked down at her hands, trying to control the rush of emotions that threatened to break through. "What good is it, Lieutenant? If no one knows, if no one cares, then what was it all for? I did everything they asked. I followed the rules, and when I saw the danger, I did everything I could to stop it. But now it's like I don't exist, like I never mattered." Harris stepped closer, his voice low. "But you did matter. You were right. You saved us. It just doesn't fit into the story they want to tell. The one where the generals and the officers are the heroes. But it was you, Miss Steele. You saw it first, and I'll remember that. You'll be remembered." Margaret shook her head slowly, her throat tight with emotion. "They don't remember the small ones, Lieutenant. History doesn't have a place for us. It's too busy glorifying the people who played by the rules, the ones who didn't question authority. It's the ones like me who get erased, forgotten." Harris didn't reply at first, but his eyes were kind. He could see the toll the silence had taken on her, the weight of a victory that had turned hollow. "You might not be in the record books, Miss Steele, but you're in my memory. You're in the memory of those who were there. And sometimes that's enough." Margaret forced a small smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. She appreciated his kindness, but the words felt like a thin bandage over a much deeper wound. The truth was, Lieutenant Harris couldn't change what had happened. The system had already decided. The narrative had been written, and it didn't include her. The door clicked shut softly behind him as he left, and Margaret was alone again, the only sound in the room the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. The world had moved on. History had moved on. But she was stuck here in the silence, waiting for something that would never come. Her gaze fell to the stack of papers on her desk, filled with reports and observations that had never made it past the bureaucratic machine. The war had ended, but its ghosts lingered, haunting her with the questions she would never have answers to. How many others like her had been swallowed by the machine? How many quiet victories had gone unrecognized, simply because they didn't fit the story the world wanted to hear?